I'm George Hodgin, the founder and CEO of BRC, Biopharmaceutical Research Company, and Jeff, my friend and colleague in the cannabis research space. It's good to see you. Thanks to everybody that's tuning in for our dialogue. We hope you learn a little something, and it's always great to connect with good people and old friends in the space. So, Jeff, thanks for being here. And if you want to give everybody a just quick overview of who you are and how we know each other.
Sure. Well, hey, thanks for having me, George. My background is I was the founder and director of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative. I'm a physician by training, and now I am the co-founder of Radical Science, which is a new company that I've recently started after leaving UCLA. And, George, I've had the pleasure of knowing you because while at UCLA, we were looking for cannabis material that we could actually legally study as a federally funded institution, and we were looking for alternatives to the NIDA drug supply at University of Mississippi. And you were, kind of one of the few people that was anywhere near close to having stuff we could study. So we've been through some adventures together trying to figure out how to get the research done.
No kidding. So I remember the first time, Jeff, you and I met, and we sat down for lunch. It was, I think, in either 2016 or 2017 in Berkeley at a conference called Patients Out of Time. And you and I had just attended a talk by Dr. Cooper, Ziva Cooper, all about the 2017 guidance that was released from the National Academies of Sciences and Medicine and Engineering. And the overwhelming takeaway from this just esteemed group of scientists was we need more cannabis research. If you're pro-cannabis, then research makes sense because it's certainly not, there is and there will be demonstrated medical value. And frankly, like anti-cannabis people probably want to learn more about the harms of cannabis. So I think it's really interesting that you and I's paths have crossed in this sort of cannabis research space. But I've always found it fascinating because you're an MBA and an MD. How did you decide to enter the cannabis space and the research space in particular?
Yeah, sure. So, it was interesting. While I was in medical school, my whole kind of perspective was if it wasn't FDA approved, it was snake oil, and I didn't want to talk about it. And it was actually through my patients kind of describing some of the life-changing experiences that they had with cannabis, where I was like, okay, that's intriguing. There's something here. And so I'm going around UCLA, nobody's researching it. It's not being taught about the medical school. And doctors at UCLA are still prohibited from recommending it. And so, okay, there's clearly a disconnect here.
Really?
Ungodly.
To this day, is that still the case?
To this day, doctors at UCLA are not allowed to recommend cannabis. And that's because UCLA is a federally funded institution. So despite what's happening at the state level, it's almost like we're oblivious to what's happening at the state level. We follow the federal guidelines. And so that was what kind of led me to say, okay, let's figure out a way to push more research and education here. And really what I saw was, yes, cannabis is important, but this was really about a whole world of marginalized treatments that were kind of just brushed aside because of politics or illegality, or the fact that they didn't really have a great patent and monopoly model to serve kind of the pharmaceutical drug development pipeline, which is why no one ever really learned about it. There wasn't funding for it. It never got commercialized. So I saw cannabis as a gateway, not so much a gateway drug, but I saw it as a gateway herb to kind of opening people's perspectives of what non-pharmaceutical treatments lay out there that might be, effective and safe and democratized, like cannabis. You can't patent it, you can't monopolize it. So that's what kind of led me to throw my hat into the ring and start the initiative at UCLA around cannabis.
What you're describing, Jeff, around the inability for university researchers and biotech and even pharmaceutical researchers and developers is exactly why I started BRC. So I had a similar experience from the patient side, not on the practitioner, on the educator or student side, but I was involved in the healthcare of a friend of mine, a veteran, fellow Navy Special Operations veteran. I was involved in his healthcare, and we were I was helping him at the VA, the Veterans Affairs Hospital. And after a nasty experience with opioids and benzos for chronic pain and sort of interwoven with PTSD, my friend started to inquire to his doctor about the possibilities of medical cannabis. And this was in 2016 in California. And the doctor said, look, at the end of the day, it's not going to kill you if you want to try it, but there's no way for me to effectively answer some of the questions you're asking about drug-drug interaction, what dosing regimen should you take? He even asked, look, his wife and he were trying to conceive. Are there any implications of this drug if we're trying to conceive a child? And I was shocked because I had friends and classmates at Stanford who could have, who were using ease and they were getting cannabis within like 7 minutes delivered to the dorm room. And here's this doctor saying like, we can't actually answer many of the legitimate questions that you would ask about any other medicine or drug. And so that's why I started BRC, is to be able to produce federally compliant, meaning DEA legal, DEA approved cannabis, flower, oil, et cetera, for researchers and developers who want to answer these questions and take their drugs through the FDA route. I'd be curious, I know you and I both have had really interesting experiences on the DEA front. UCLA has to get DEA licenses and DEA registrations to do their own research. I'd be curious about your experiences at the Institute at UCLA with respect to like getting the approvals to study a controlled substance and the importance of, once you're in that system, the importance of not violating the federal law if you're a university or what have you.
Sure. Yeah. So, UCLA and like almost every university in this country, they receive tons of federal funding. And so when you receive federal funding, first off, there's a bunch of rules you have to follow when you receive federal funding and you're carrying out certain research activities, but you're also even above and beyond the rules. You're always being proactive to make sure you're on the right side of the feds because you don't want to lose your federal funding. So again, despite California legalizing cannabis back in the 1990s, 25 years ago, we still are completely oblivious. We do not follow a single piece of state law when it comes to cannabis. We follow what the federal guidelines say. And so, yes, you have to, despite there being a dispensary, literally across the street from my office, there's a dispensary in Westwood, and you see, people going in and out buying weed all day. That cannabis cannot come on campus. We cannot study that cannabis. We cannot touch it. We have to go spend a very lengthy process getting a DEA Schedule I license, because cannabis is a Schedule I drug that allows us to study it. But in the process of getting that license, we have to build special security systems, certain safes that can't be broken into because someone might steal the cannabis, apparently, background checks, this whole rigmarole. And that's assuming we somehow found funding for the study. There's not a ton of funding out there for cannabis, particularly around the therapeutic uses. There's lots of funding for the harms, but not much funding for the therapeutic use. So we still got to come up with our own funding. And then after all of this, we are rewarded by being able to purchase cannabis from the federal government. And the cannabis that we purchase is grown at the one and only federally legal cannabis farm in America at the University of Mississippi. And it's to no fault to the people running the farm there. What happened was the genetics that they started with back in 1970 are the only genetics that they've been allowed to use since. They've not been allowed to bring in outside genetics. So they've just been breeding and rebreeding the same low potency generic cannabis that they had from 50 years ago. That's kind of what they've been forced to do. And the way that it's freeze dried and prepared is very different than what people are using today. And moreover, they do not make capsules, they do not make vape oils, they do not make tinctures or edibles. It's really just flower, either in raw form or rolled into a joint is essentially what they offer you to buy from them. So then we have to buy this cannabis. So, which is why I'm really excited that there's folks like BRC that one day soon can offer cannabis that is federally legal so that researchers have something to study that actually resembles the cannabis that's being used in the real world. And that is grown a certain way, that is prepared a certain way so that it's actually valid to what people are using every day. And I think it's quite fitting, and for those that don't know your background, I think it's quite fitting that George, you as a former Navy SEAL now are being able to produce the material that the researchers need, and above all else around cannabis. So I think it's actually a really nice, beautiful story there.
Well, thank you. And likewise, I think what you're doing to go from founding the Cannabis Research Institute at UCLA and then to what you're doing now with Radical Sciences is equally cool and powerful. And so I'd like to hear from a business perspective, but with medicine in mind, what you think the opportunity for cannabis as a medicine is. I think there's been so much promise in cannabis, but if it's the public markets lately, if it's a lot of sort of bad stories about the industry. I mean, look, by and large, I think the industry is doing great and there's amazing people in it. But like anything, a few rotten apples or bad news stories can pollute people's minds. I'd love to hear the optimistic view that you have on how cannabis can help the most people as a therapeutic and as a medicine. Like, what do you see the promise as, with your medical background?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's immense therapeutic potential to cannabis, but cannabis is a very broad plant, right? So what we're really saying is there's all these unique compounds called cannabinoids that exist nowhere else in nature, and they happen to all cluster in the cannabis plant. And the potential is fascinating, right? So there's things that we all commonly hear about: impacts on sleep, impacts on mood, impacts on pain. But what's also really interesting is cannabinoids are antioxidants. They are anti-inflammatories. They have anti-cancer properties. Now, none of this has been demonstrated in humans. It's kind of stuck at the animal stage. But what results in chronic disease, or what causes chronic disease? It's inflammation. It's oxidative stress. All of these things. And so, I think the truth is somewhere in between. There's people who say cannabis is a panacea. There's people who say cannabis is a dangerous drug. The truth is somewhere in between. And I think that there's probably been an over-reliance on THC as the main kind of therapeutic agent. We probably don't need, 30% THC cannabis per se to be therapeutic. And there's probably some nice middle ground where, yes, you have THC, which has lots of therapeutic properties, as well as all the other accessory cannabinoids. And I get really excited at the prospect that we can eventually start to tease this apart. And that's actually why we created Radical Science. It was the idea that if you're a university, you're not really able to play in the cannabis game. And so we're creating kind of an independent private research center, detached from the FDA, detached from pharma, detached from federal funding, and we can work with state legal cannabis. That's the idea. We can run clinical trials on them. We can validate them. We can help understand them. And so I'm excited. Now, another thing is we're probably going to find a lot of the anecdotes that people were talking about weren't really there. It was either placebo effect or biases and all of that. And also there is a harm to cannabis, right? Just like anything, even, too much cake is harmful. So, we do need to be aware.
To that after
yeah, exactly.
Being locked down during COVID, very harmful.
Right. So yeah, too much cake is harmful. Certainly pharmaceutical drugs have downsides. Dietary supplements, if you take too much of it, they have downsides too. And cannabis is no different. And so it's really about a kind of always calculating a benefit-risk ratio, right? Benefit-risk ratio. And that's where I think the conversation needs to go. Like, yes, cannabis might be able to improve sleep, but if you're someone who has a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, what's that benefit to risk ratio, right? We don't want to, there's some evidence that using cannabis, particularly THC, can increase the odds you go from just having a genetic risk to having schizophrenia itself. That's a horrible outcome. So maybe for that person, maybe we don't use that. We don't use THC for sleep. So I think that's where the evidence needs to go.
And how do you think the federal government, through your interactions, and I imagine talking with different policymakers at UCLA and government affairs folks, you have a good finger on the pulse of how the FDA and the DEA think about cannabis. We know how they think about cannabis is adverse effects and the downsides. But how do you think they institutionally consider the therapeutic effects or the potential therapeutic effects?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is actually where everyone from the National Academies of Science all the way to the FDA, they've come out saying, of course, we want more research and education. And of course, if there's therapeutic value, we want that to be better understood, commercialized, and available. But the road bump they keep coming up with, as I understand it, is the DEA, who's saying that, here's the thing that you can study. It's a bunch of dried sticks and stems from Mississippi. Here's what you can study, and go find your own money for it, and go be patient and spend years getting the right licenses to study this.
Right.
So I think, and also I don't think there's any, oftentimes we're very quick to judge individuals or the people running the organization. It's not really their fault. It's the system. Blame the system. And the system kind of takes on a consciousness of its own and a inertia of its own, whereas the people are kind of just, they're kind of at the mercy of the system. So I think it's one thing where I think everyone, even in government, they kind of realize what needs to happen, but the system is in the way.
I agree. And I think we've encountered that. I've encountered that, frankly. I think even just in sort of off the record meeting with different DEA investigators or agents that we've worked with and certainly been inspected by. I mean, we have several other activities besides hopefully soon cultivating cannabis for medical research, all DEA endorsed and DEA registered projects or licensed activities. And what we found is sort of institutionally or the front that they put on, like in anybody in any new meeting a new person, there's this sort of us versus them. And then after a little bit of rapport is built and there's a relationship, almost all of them have said hey, what do you think? Is this CBD thing actually good? My mom's taking it, or my aunt's taking it. Or is it really going to be that bad? My kid's going to college. I'm worried he's going to smoke weed. And we found that on the individual level, it's actually been, they're professionals just like everybody else.
Right.
And this one roadblock, we think, of being able to provide federally legal cannabis for research could, we think, be the thing that breaks the catch-22 in the US around federal cannabis legalization. There's so much talk about reform at the congressional level with the MORE Act, the States Act, the safe banking. But at the end of the day, I mean, obviously, no matter where you sit, or no matter what side of the fence you sit on, it just seems like Congress is apathetic to anything, and there's an incredible amount of inertia. And so placing our hands in the fate of Congress is just really dangerous. And our hope is that through being able to provide cannabis to researchers in places like your alma mater and former home at UCLA, researchers will be able to show that there's a demonstrable medical value with cannabis. And as soon as you do that, then the requirement for meeting Schedule I goes away. And so in our mind, if we can provide the cannabis for research, Schedule I requirement goes away. All of a sudden, if it gets rescheduled to Schedule II, Schedule III, who knows what happens, but it becomes much easier. The barriers to entry from the researcher side are removed, and you can help many, many, many more people to all the points you made. So I agree with you very much about sort of the system being broken, and we're hoping that we can kind of break it down from the inside.
And I think your analysis is correct. I think it's the catch-22 is show us the data that says that it should be removed from Schedule I. And we go, well, there's, we can't really research it. There's no funding, and it's really hard to get the right material. And they go, well, come back next year,
Yeah.
So it would be amazing if researchers had access, because I think the funding mechanisms, first off, there was lack of interest too amongst researchers. The interest is there. Some of them have been able to navigate getting the Schedule I licenses. And so that final kind of piece, that final domino is having material that hopefully one day BRC can be providing. And here's the other thing to realize is that the material needs to be grown in a very standardized fashion. And that's because if someone's using something medically, batch to batch, you need that margin of error to be within about 10% of the major constituents in that product, right?
Right.
And so it's really hard to achieve that in any sort of non-controlled environment, whether outdoor greenhouse, probably really tough to do that. So if you're really talking about true medical cannabis, you're going to need an indoor completely controlled environment. And there's probably few state legal cannabis growers that are at the requirements that I suspect that you guys are going to are holding accountable to in your SOPs. And
Absolutely.
so, and so that's kind of some different calculus too. There might be one level of criteria for cannabis that's research grade and medical grade, and then like maybe another criteria where it's just, adult use, wellness grade, et cetera. And that's okay. Just like how there's prescription strength products that you have to get through prescription in the pharmacy, or there's the less potent version you can buy over the counter. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay for that dichotomy.
There's an orthopedic surgeon we're working with on some research protocols, and he described this very well to you. Like, one of the questions people have asked us in starting our business is like, well, who cares? What's the point? Is it cannabis just going to be legalized completely anyway? And my thought to that is like, one, you've clearly never dealt with the federal government or the FDA or DEA, because it takes them forever to do anything. I mean, we're 3 years into the Farm Bill and there's still no regulatory framework for CBD.
Around
like
hemp and CBD, yeah.
Throw THC into the mix and it's going to be like 2050 before they get it figured out. So our thesis has always been, look, working within the DEA and the FDA system doesn't give us the opportunity to sell to consumers at the dispensary, but it does allow us to develop drugs and sell to drug developers and researchers. And I think, in my opinion, I think you could easily see where the market ends up splitting, or the cannabis industry sort of diverges at some point, and you have the adult use and then the wellness use, which I think you could equate to like over-the-counter Tylenol. And then there's the prescription controlled substance like a Tylenol with codeine. And they're both indicated for very different things. And they both work well and for some people, but it's like you've got your adult use that you purchase at the dispensary, your Tylenol that you can go get at the CVS, and then your Tylenol with codeine that your insurance is going to pay for and you need a prescription. And we're focused on the latter, but that's not to say that it's just
to the exclusion of the former, right? It all coexists, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And a good way to look at this is Epidiolex, right? It's the one and only CBD product that's FDA approved right now. It's for kids with epilepsy. Yes, the parents could go buy CBD over the counter, but epilepsy is a pretty serious condition and these kids are pretty sick. So the parents don't want to run the risk that they buy something over the counter and maybe it didn't have as much CBD as they thought they did, or maybe it had contaminants. So they're willing to go through the process of getting a prescription, going to the pharmacy, and getting the product. And in this case, their insurance covers it, which is great, because at the doses that these sick kids need, these parents would be broke buying CBD over the counter. So I think you're right that I think that is the natural dichotomy where things will settle. And again, you already see it in the dietary supplement space as well. There's like prescription, there's like fish oil you can get, and then there's like prescription strength omegas that are synthetic, and they're much more expensive, but insurance covers it. So some patients rather would do that. Others, they want the natural stuff. They want the fish oil. So that's both okay. You talked about the glacial pace of even implementing the Farm Bill. I'm very curious if you could tell us a bit about the origin story of like when the DEA said that they would award licenses, when you guys applied, and then just like what's happened since all that.
Oh man, yeah. Speaking of glacial pace. So 2016, I'll give you the rundown. Otherwise we'd be here for 3 hours. 2016, Congress, the DEA, the DOJ, and the FDA. Sorry, acronym soup. I feel like I'm back in the military. FDA is in charge of regulating drugs in the country. DEA in charge of regulating controlled drugs, meaning dangerous ones. DOJ, Department of Justice, which is the parent organization of the DEA. Those groups all recognize the problem that you and I have been discussing, which is that 200 million Americans, consumers, can access cannabis unless they're a researcher, doctor, or scientist, and then they can't effectively. That's clearly a problem because doctors aren't able to figure out what's going on with consumer behavior. So the government said in 2016, hey, we're going to open up this process and allow for what they call an additional bulk marijuana Schedule I manufacturing registration. In real person's terms, that means they're going to allow more people to grow and produce cannabis products for research, in addition to the University of Mississippi, which we've discussed. Even in the absence of any this being anything weird or new in the DEA's eyes, registering a manufacturer of a controlled substance takes a long time. It takes like 12 to 18 months, most generally. But throw the fact that this is cannabis into the mix, and here we are 3.5 years later, still waiting on the federal government. And in the meantime, what's happened is 2017, sort of nothing happened. The DEA said several times, like, effectively, don't call us, we'll call you. We're working on it. 2018, it comes out through several publicly reported on lawsuits that the DEA had internally relied on a memorandum that more or less said, like, this program is really challenging to implement and might be not consistent with treaty obligations. So we need to go back to the drawing board. That was 2-3 years later. Continue on into 2019. And finally, the federal government, again, the heads of the agencies I just described, at the 11th hour before entering into court, a lawsuit, the DEA published a notification saying, okay, great, guys, we're publicly signaling and confirming that we are moving forward with this program. We will allow additional producers, like us, like BRC, to produce cannabis. August 2019, March 2020, they released the rules they released the federal cannabis regulatory framework in the United States in draft form. And 60 days later, so summer of 2020, the opportunity for the public to amend or comment on those draft rules expired. And here we are. We think the final regulatory framework will be published and confirmed and set in stone literally any day now. Like, could be tomorrow, could be next week. But once that happens, we think the US federal cannabis landscape is going to look very similar to some of the countries around the world that have legalized medical regimes. If it's Netherlands through the Office of Medical Cannabis, the early days in Canada, where Health Canada, there was no adult use. You still can't sell to, we don't think, we won't be able to sell to a consumer, but the initial work of being able to sell to universities and develop products, we'll be able to do. And we think that could happen. Like I said, it's imminent. So we're excited. We have a team that's like completely chomping at the bit to get going, because it's been a long fight, but we're proud to do it.
That's great. And again, I think it's important to note that this is, again, it's like, this is almost, it'll exist in parallel to state legal cannabis. And in fact, the more quickly that research can be done, the more that policy can be evidence-based around how to deal with the states that have legalized cannabis and how to change the regulations over time. So yeah, it's really exciting. I'm glad you guys threw your hat into the ring. I know you have your MBA from Stanford, and with your former military service as well. I think it's just a matter of time to get that license going, and the researchers need it. The community needs it. And in the meantime, for the companies that are state legal, that's kind of like what Radical Science is for, coming in to be able to work with them. We're not going to be able to work with the federal material that you'll be producing, but the idea is that we can at least serve the state products and get some clinical trial data and evidence generation behind them. But it's exciting, man. I'm rooting for you any day now, I hope.
Thank you. I hope so too. There's days when I'm like, God, I mean, not to be cavalier about it, but I'm like, man, getting shot at by the Taliban was just emotionally more challenging than waiting on the DEA to let me grow cannabis. Like, it's at least it's a known entity and a known quantity. The DEA is just a black box, and you have no idea what's going on in there. But well, thanks, Jeff. This has been awesome. I appreciate this. I've learned a little bit and a lot more actually about your company. It's great to reconnect and post-COVID. Can't wait to see you again in person. And to anybody else out there, check out our website, www.biopharmaresearchco.com. And Jeff, if you want to just direct people to your profile.
We don't have a website yet. We're just getting off the ground, but stay tuned for more good stuff to come.
Awesome. Can't wait to watch you guys' success. Thanks, everyone.